She said it like it didn't cost her anything. Give them everything. And for a moment, everyone in that room believed she had just handed her life away. Denise Carter was 68 years old, living in Boise, Idaho, in a house she and her husband had paid off years ago, the kind of house built from decades of early mornings, long shifts, and quiet discipline. Her husband had just been buried. The business they built together, a commercial laundry service that ran like clockwork for local restaurants and small hotels, was still running. From the outside, nothing had collapsed yet. But inside that conference room, something had already broken. People later said they couldn't understand how she stayed so calm, how she didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't even hesitate when the documents were placed in front of her. They said it didn't look like grief. It looked like surrender. What they didn't see was everything she had already done before that moment. They didn't see the nights she spent going through records, or the calls she made that no one knew about. By the time she spoke those 5 words, she wasn't reacting anymore. She was setting the stage. Before we go any further, tell me what time it is, where you're watching from, and which city you're in. I always want to know how far these stories travel. And if you're new here, leave a comment and consider subscribing, because stories like this don't end the way people expect. A few days after the funeral, the tone in the family changed. Denise Carter noticed it first in the way her son spoke to her. Not unkind, not openly cold, but different, like he had already moved past something she was still standing inside. The house still smelled faintly of the food people had brought over. Untouched dishes stacked near the sink, sympathy cards lined along the counter, and yet the conversations had already shifted. Raymond Carter had built the business with his hands. Denise had built it with numbers. Together, they had turned a small laundry route into a steady commercial operation that serviced diners, motels, and a handful of clinics across Boise. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was reliable, and reliability had paid for everything: the house, the trucks, the equipment, and the life they had lived. Their son, Travis Carter, had worked in that business on and off for years. He knew the routes, knew some of the clients, knew how things looked from the outside. But he had never sat where Denise sat. He had never dealt with contracts or liability terms, or the quiet weight of decisions that didn't show up on a delivery schedule. For days after the funeral, Travis called. He didn't ask how she was sleeping. He didn't ask if she needed anything. He asked about the accounts. "Mom, we need to figure out what happens next," he said, his tone careful but direct. "The business can't just sit." Denise stood at the kitchen counter while he spoke, her hand resting on a stack of unopened mail. She told him she understood. She told him they would talk soon. What she didn't say was that nothing in that moment felt like next steps. It still felt like an ending. The second shift came from Angela Carter. She showed up unannounced one morning, carrying coffee and speaking softly, almost gently, but her eyes moved differently. She walked through the house with a kind of quiet assessment, pausing in doorways, glancing at corners, noticing space in a way that didn't belong to a guest. At one point, she stood near the back room that Raymond had used for paperwork and said, almost to herself, "This could be a really efficient home office." She didn't look at Denise when she said it. Denise noticed. By the time the first week had passed, small things had started to stack. Travis began calling the business directly instead of going through Denise. He asked questions about delivery schedules, equipment maintenance, client retention, questions that sounded responsible, but arrived too quickly, too specifically. Scott Mercer, the operations manager who had been with them for over a decade, mentioned it one evening when he stopped by. He chose his words carefully, the way people do when they don't want to get pulled into something but feel they should say something anyway. "He's been asking about contracts," Scott said. "Details we don't usually go into unless we're reviewing accounts." Denise thanked him and told him to keep answering. She wanted to know what Travis thought he was looking for. By the end of that week, the shape of it was no longer unclear. It wasn't concern. It wasn't confusion. It was intention. The letter arrived when the house had finally gone quiet. It came in a standard envelope, nothing marked urgent, nothing that would have stood out in the stack of mail Denise had been avoiding all week. She opened it at the kitchen table, the same place she and Raymond had sat every morning for years, and read it once without reacting. Then she read it again, slower. The letter was from a law firm in downtown Boise. It stated in measured language that Travis Carter was formally requesting a review of the ownership and operational control of Carter Industrial Laundry Services. It argued that as the most actively involved family member in recent years, Travis had a reasonable claim to assume primary control of the business. There was more. There was language suggesting that Raymond Carter's decisions in the final months of his life might not have fully reflected long-term business stability. Not stated outright, not aggressive but carefully placed, just enough to create doubt where none had existed before. Denise folded the letter neatly and set it on the table. For a long moment she didn't move. The man she had buried less than a week ago had sat across from her 8 months earlier, reviewing documents line by line, asking questions the way he always did. Slow, precise, unwilling to sign anything he didn't understand. There had been no confusion, no hesitation. She knew that. And she knew something else. This letter hadn't come from grief. It had come from planning. The next morning Martin Hale called. He had been their attorney for years, the kind of lawyer who didn't speak unless there was something worth saying. His voice carried a tension she hadn't heard from him before. "Denise, you cannot ignore this," he said. "They're positioning this as a control issue, not just inheritance. That changes everything." She listened without interrupting. Martin went on to explain what the language in the letter was designed to do. To pressure, to destabilize, to create a narrative where Travis stepping in would look reasonable, even necessary. If it went uncontested, it could shift how everything was negotiated moving forward. "You need to respond," he said. "And you need to be very clear." Denise looked at the letter again, still lying flat on the table. "I understand," she said. There was a pause on the line, as if Martin expected more. Anger, resistance, something sharper. It didn't come. Instead, she asked him one question. "If we meet with them," she said, "can it be arranged quickly?" Martin hesitated. "Yes. But Denise, we're not going into that meeting to concede anything." She didn't answer that directly. After she hung up, she sat in the same chair for a long time. The house quiet in a way that felt different now. Not heavy, not hollow, just still. Then she picked up her phone and called Travis. When he answered, she kept her voice even. "I've read the letter," she said. "Have your lawyer set up a meeting." There was a brief silence on the other end, just long enough to register surprise. "Okay," Travis said. "We can do that." "I've thought about it," Denise added. Another pause. "I don't want this to turn into a long legal fight," she said. "I'm willing to discuss giving you what you're asking for." This time the silence stretched. Then Travis spoke again, and his tone had shifted, subtly but enough. "All right," he said. "I'll have them reach out." What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Denise had already decided how that meeting was going to end. That night, Denise went back to the office records. The room Raymond had used for paperwork still smelled faintly of machine oil and detergent, a mix that had followed him home for decades. Denise turned on the desk lamp and opened the filing cabinet without hesitation, pulling folders the way she had done thousands of times before, except this time she wasn't organizing. She was auditing. From the outside, Carter Industrial Laundry Services was simple. Pickup routes, deliveries, clean linen going out, used linen coming back. But inside it was layered. Long-term service agreements with restaurants, supply contracts with small medical offices, equipment leases tied to specific usage thresholds, and a rotating credit line that had been refinanced more than once to keep the operation stable through slower seasons. Denise spread the most recent records across the desk and began working through them. Not as a widow, not as a mother, but as the person who had tracked every dollar moving through that business for years. She made a list. Assets first, the building lease, the fleet of delivery vans, the industrial washers and dryers, all accounted for, all tied to specific agreements. Then liabilities, the equipment financing, vendor commitments, and the credit structure that connected it all. What Travis saw was a functioning business. What he didn't see was how tightly everything was connected. The next morning, she met with Martin Hale in his office. He had already reviewed the letter again, marking sections with quiet frustration. "They're pushing on perception," he said. "If they can make it look like you're not positioned to run this alone, they gain leverage." Denise nodded, but her attention wasn't on the letter anymore. "I need someone who understands the structure underneath," she said. "Not just the legal side." Martin studied her for a moment, then reached for his phone. "There's someone I want you to talk to," he said. "Naomi Bennett. Estate and business structuring. She doesn't waste time." Naomi Bennett didn't. When Denise met her later that afternoon, the conversation moved quickly. Naomi didn't ask how Denise was holding up. She asked what had been signed, what hadn't, and who had authority over what. Denise answered every question. By the end of the meeting, Naomi had a clear picture. "You're not as exposed as they think," she said. "But you are exposed if you let them define the timeline." She explained the difference carefully, what Denise owned outright, what was tied to operational control, and what could be repositioned before any formal dispute advanced further. "You need to separate ownership from access," Naomi said. "Right now they think those are the same thing." That distinction changed everything. Later that week, Denise made another call. Valerie Kent had worked with Raymond and Denise years earlier when they restructured their equipment financing. She wasn't a lawyer, but she understood how the business had been built from the inside. How obligations were layered, how signatures mattered, how responsibility was assigned even when it wasn't obvious. When Valerie came by, Denise laid out the documents. Valerie reviewed them slowly, her expression tightening at certain points, relaxing at others. "They're looking at the surface," she said finally. "They don't understand what triggers what." Denise leaned back slightly. "That's what I thought." Between Naomi's strategy and Valerie's clarity, the picture settled into place. Travis wasn't preparing to take over the business. He was preparing to take something he didn't fully understand. And that was the one mistake Denise knew how to use. The first meeting was held downtown, exactly where Travis wanted it. Denise arrived early. She chose a seat that faced the door, set her folder on the table, and waited without looking at her phone. When Travis walked in with Angela beside him, both of them carried the quiet confidence of people who believed the outcome had already been decided. Angela was dressed carefully, professional, composed, the kind of presence meant to signal control without saying it directly. Travis looked more focused than Denise had seen him in years, his posture tighter, his attention fixed. Their attorney followed, introducing himself with practiced ease, offering condolences that felt efficient rather than personal. Martin Hale arrived shortly after, taking the seat beside Denise, his expression measured but alert. Naomi Bennett entered last. She didn't greet anyone beyond a brief nod. She placed a thin folder on the table and sat down without speaking. The meeting began with Travis's attorney outlining their position. He spoke about operational continuity, about active contribution, about the need for decisive leadership in a business that depended on consistency. He framed Travis as the natural successor, not by entitlement but by involvement. It was a clean argument. It was also incomplete. Denise let him finish. She didn't interrupt, didn't react, didn't shift in her chair. When the attorney paused, expecting a response, she opened her folder and slid a document across the table. "Before we discuss terms," she said, her voice even, "we should be clear about what control actually means in this business." The document wasn't complicated to look at, but it carried weight. It outlined the current authority structure tied to operational liability, who could make binding decisions, who carried financial responsibility if contracts failed, and how those roles were legally connected to existing obligations with vendors and lenders. Travis's attorney picked it up and began reading. At first, his expression didn't change. Then his pace slowed. Angela leaned slightly forward, trying to follow along, but the language wasn't designed for quick understanding. It connected multiple agreements, each one dependent on the next, forming a structure that couldn't be separated without consequences. "That structure was updated recently," Naomi said, her tone neutral, "in full compliance with existing agreements." The attorney looked up. "Updated how?" he asked. Denise slid a second document across. "This outlines the revised access controls tied to those obligations," she said. "Operational authority is now contingent on assumption of full liability under the current financing terms." Silence settled over the table. Travis frowned slightly, looking between the documents as if trying to locate the point where control could be separated from risk. It wasn't there. As it couldn't be. Angela's posture shifted, just enough to break the confidence she had walked in with. Travis's attorney flipped through the pages again, this time more carefully, his earlier rhythm gone. "And these were filed?" he asked. "Yes," Naomi replied. "Within the appropriate window." Denise reached for her coffee, calm, unhurried. "What you're asking for," she said, looking directly at Travis now, isn't just control of the business. It's full responsibility for everything tied to it. Every contract, every obligation, every risk. She let that settle. If that's what you want, she added, we can keep talking. No one spoke immediately, because for the first time since the letter had arrived, the conversation had shifted. Not in tone, in reality. After that meeting, they stopped sounding aggressive and started sounding careful. The calls came first. Travis's tone softened in a way that might have sounded reasonable to someone who hadn't been in that conference room. He spoke about stability, about making things easier, about not letting everything become complicated when it didn't have to be. He said the business was too demanding for one person to handle alone, especially now. Denise listened. She let him speak all the way through each time, never interrupting, never correcting, never agreeing to anything beyond acknowledging that she had heard him. A few days later, Angela sent a message. It was warmer, more personal, written as if the legal conversation had never happened. She mentioned the kids. She mentioned how much they missed their grandmother. She suggested they all spend time together. No pressure, no discussions, just family. Denise agreed to see them. The meeting took place at a small school event where Aaron had a role in a classroom presentation. Denise sat in the second row watching quietly, clapping when everyone else clapped, smiling when Aaron looked out into the room and found her. Afterward, in the parking lot, the conversation shifted. Travis stood beside her car, hands in his pockets, speaking in a lower voice now. We don't have to make this difficult, he said. We can figure something out that works for everyone. Denise unlocked the car but didn't open the door. I'm listening, she said. He talked about structure, how they could share responsibilities, how he could take on operations while she stepped back, how everything could stay in the family, without involving lawyers any further. It was presented as a solution. It wasn't one. Denise didn't respond beyond a brief nod. A few days later, they came to the house. This time it wasn't unannounced. Travis had called ahead. Angela brought something with her, an attempt at familiarity, something to place on the table as if that might reset the tone of the room. They sat in the living room, not the kitchen. The difference mattered. Travis spoke first, careful again, repeating the same ideas in slightly different words. Angela followed, adding details, softening edges, reinforcing the idea that what they wanted was cooperation, not conflict. Denise let them finish. Then Travis leaned forward slightly, his voice shifting. Not louder, not sharper, but different. There are things about the business, he said, that could get complicated if people start looking too closely. The room went quiet. Angela didn't interrupt. She watched Denise instead, her expression steady, waiting. Travis continued, choosing his words carefully. Some of the financial structure, he said. The way certain things were set up over the years. It's not always as straightforward as it looks. Denise didn't move. She let the silence stretch just long enough for the meaning to settle without being stated outright. It wasn't concern. It wasn't advice. It was pressure. She looked at her son, her expression unchanged. Is there a question in that, she asked, or are you making a statement? Travis hesitated for a fraction of a second. Angela stepped in, her tone smoother. We're just saying, she said. It would be better for everyone if this didn't turn into something bigger than it needs to be. Denise sat back slightly, her hands resting calmly in her lap. For a moment no one spoke. Then she nodded once. I think it's time for you both to head home, she said. There was no anger in her voice. No raised tone. Just finality. They left without arguing. And in the quiet that followed, Denise reached for her phone, not to call them back, but to secure what had just been said. The second meeting felt different before anyone even sat down. Denise arrived with Naomi Bennett and Martin Hale, both of them already aware that the tone would not resemble the first meeting. There was no sense of negotiation this time, no expectation of exploring options. Across the table, Travis and Angela were quieter. Their attorney spoke less at the beginning, choosing his words with more care, as if aware that something had shifted but not yet certain how far. Naomi didn't wait for the usual formalities. She opened her folder and slid a document across the table. Before we move forward, she said, there's something that needs to be addressed. The document was several pages long. At the top, a transcription. Denise's attorney placed a small device beside it, no larger than a phone. The conversation referenced here took place at Mrs. Carter's home, Martin said, his tone controlled. It was recorded legally. Travis stared at the document without touching it. Angela reached for it first, her composure holding for a moment before her eyes moved faster across the page, scanning rather than reading. The room stayed quiet. No one rushed them, because the words on that page didn't need explanation. They were clear enough on their own. When Travis finally spoke, his voice had lost its earlier steadiness. "You recorded us?" he asked. Denise met his gaze without hesitation. "It was my home," she said. "I had that right." Angela set the document down slowly, her earlier confidence no longer visible. Their attorney leaned forward, reading more carefully now, his expression tightening in a way that signaled recognition, not surprise but consequence. Naomi spoke again. "The language used in that conversation," she said, "introduces a different set of considerations, not just for this matter, but for anything that follows." No one interrupted her, because they understood. What had been implied before was now documented. What had been pressure was now evidence. Travis leaned back in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table briefly before releasing. "What do you want?" he asked. It was the first direct question he had asked since the meeting began. Denise didn't look at Naomi or Martin. She answered herself. "A complete withdrawal of all claims," she said. "Filed and finalized. No revisions, no alternative language." She paused just long enough to let it register. "And a signed acknowledgement that the structure and ownership of this business reflect exactly what was intended. No future disputes. No reinterpretation later." Angela exhaled slowly, her gaze dropping for a moment before lifting again. Their attorney didn't respond immediately. He asked for a recess. When they stepped out of the room, the silence that followed felt different. Not uncertain, not tense, but resolved in a way that didn't require discussion. Denise sat still, her hands folded, her posture unchanged. Naomi reviewed a page in her folder without speaking. Martin leaned back slightly, watching the door. When Travis and Angela returned, they didn't sit right away. Their attorney did the talking. "My clients are prepared to accept those terms," he said. There was no attempt to negotiate, no attempt to soften the outcome, just acceptance. The documents were brought in, pages turned, signatures placed. Travis signed first. Angela followed. Denise didn't rush the process. She watched each page as it was completed, each line finalized, each possibility of reversal closed. When it was done, she gathered her copy and stood. Travis looked at her then as if expecting something, an acknowledgement, a word, anything that suggested this had been something temporary. It wasn't. Denise met his gaze briefly. Then she turned and walked out of the room without saying anything at all. Spring came to Boise the way it always did. Quietly at first, then all at once. Denise Carter noticed it in small things. The early light reaching further into the kitchen in the mornings, the sound of delivery trucks starting earlier on the street, the rhythm of the business settling back into something steady again. She returned to work without announcement. Scott Mercer took on a larger role in daily operations, something he had been ready for long before anyone had said it out loud. Routes were adjusted, 2 older machines were replaced, and several client contracts were reviewed and renewed under terms that were cleaner, more protective, less dependent on assumptions. The business didn't just survive. It tightened. Denise made changes at home as well. Locks were replaced. Access codes were updated. Documents that had once been kept in shared spaces were moved, reviewed, and secured properly. The structure around her life became as deliberate as the one she had reinforced in the business. There were no arguments about it. There was no discussion. It was simply done. Information in a place like Boise moves without effort. Denise didn't ask for updates about Travis or Angela, but she didn't need to. They had left the area within a few months. Not far enough to disappear, but far enough to avoid the conversations that had already started circulating. Travis had reached out to other companies in the same line of work, looking for a position that would let him step into something familiar. It didn't come together the way he expected. In a business built on contracts and reliability, reputation travels quickly, and questions follow it just as fast. Being connected to a dispute like this didn't make him unemployable, but it made him uncertain in a way employers tend to avoid. Angela pursued her own plans. A partnership opportunity, something she had mentioned briefly before, fell apart after disagreements over financial control. The details weren't public, but the outcome was unstable. Denise didn't take satisfaction in that, but she didn't look away from it either. What had happened wasn't complicated, not in the way people sometimes try to make it. It wasn't about misunderstanding. It wasn't about grief expressed poorly. It was a decision made more than once to turn pressure into leverage and family into a negotiation. Denise understood that clearly now. She also understood something else. Holding on to what she and Raymond had built didn't require anger. It required clarity. It required knowing exactly where the lines were and refusing to move them just because someone else expected her to. There were no more calls. No messages that needed to be answered. No version of events left to reconsider. The house on that street in Boise remained hers, exactly as it had been built to be. The business continued under her name, structured in a way that didn't leave room for confusion. And the distance between her and her son was no longer something waiting to be resolved. It was something that had already been decided.